Welcome to our second Lenten podcast. I am Jeremiah Childers.
And I'm Kelly Kirksey.
Today we are going to be talking about the theme of righteousness. And before we do that, we're going to be looking at Genesis 15 and talking about the story of Abraham. But Abraham's story didn't start in chapter 15. It started way back in chapter 12 of Genesis. So Kelly, would you tell us a little bit about where Abraham, formerly known as Abram, came from, and some about the journey that he has taken thus far in Genesis?
Yeah, so God has called Abraham to a specific place and time, to the promised land. And he has been faithful and followed where God has led him through many different situations and lands. If you go back and read, Abraham's story is fascinating. But what we're talking about here really begins in Genesis 12, where God promises Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, that he will have descendants like the sand, right? And so that is a lot of descendants. And we move past chapter 12 and we're at 15 now. And there has been many, many years in those 3 chapters. I mean, we only get to see the highlights of his life, but it was a long time ago that God made him this promise.
Was he young when God made the promise to him?
No, he was not young. It was a pretty unbelievable promise that God would make. You know, God makes those kind of promises where he says, I can do what no one thinks can be done. And Abraham was old then. And Sarah was old then when God said this. And so they probably assumed it would not be in that long that they would have a child, at least one, but they'd been promised nations. And so now we're years and years and years later, and there's been waiting and waiting and waiting, which everybody knows waiting is hard. Waiting in a line at an amusement park is hard, and you can already see that you actually are going to get somewhere. But Abraham and Sarah have been waiting for years for this to happen. They're only getting older, and the chances of this actually happening are only getting more and more unlikely.
So as we meet Abraham, him and Sarah are older, they're childless. They were childless before they were called. Mm-hmm. They continue to be childless. And we meet meet Abraham in chapter 15. He's still referred to as Abram. His name has not changed yet. So let's listen to the text today. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward the heaven, and count the stars if you are able to count them. Then he said to them, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Well, after hearing chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, Kelly, what are some things that come to your mind?
I just think about how hard it is to wait, and how, like, when you believe that God has called you to something, or that God has made a promise to you about something. And I don't know how many people listening to this podcast have ever had quite the experience that Abraham had walking out and seeing the stars, or even in chapter 12, where God is like, hey, I'm going to give this to you. I've never quite had that blatant of God just speaking to me. But even in the things I feel like, I feel very strongly that God is calling me to this, or I feel very strongly that God has promised me this. The wait is hard, and it does question, your faith, and you think, well, maybe did I hear wrong? Maybe God didn't say this. And so this story just really speaks to me in that idea of, like, we think, okay, I feel like God has called me to this or promised this, but then it doesn't come for a very long time. And does that mean that the promise is gone? Or does it mean, that it's coming in a way you didn't expect? Obviously, Abraham's like, hey, this should have already happened.
Yeah.
You know? And he's like, he's already been looking at it. He knows who his heir is. Mm-hmm. He knows who's going to get everything that he owns. And he's really kind of calling God to the table a little bit here at the beginning and saying, like, you promised me this and I have nothing.
One of the things that when I hear chapter 15, and part of the reason this chapter is so important is because the Apostle Paul and others in the New Testament go back to this passage and talk about what it means to be saved, made right by faith.
Right.
For me, this passage is a reminder that despite the evidence that nothing has changed, mm-hmm. that there is no future, he listens to God and believes in God, and God essentially says, I'm going to make you right. I'm going to make you whole. I'm going to make you okay. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, all Abraham has is God's word on this.
Right.
There is no evidence, and if you continue to read the story, it doesn't happen for a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time. It's going to be a long time.
And it'll be to the point where Abraham and Sarah will have a child outside of their relationship with their servant Hagar, and they'll have Ishmael. There'll also be an opportunity where God shows up in these three visitors, and they will promise, and Sarah's going to laugh.
Yeah.
And even with the knowledge that God has shown up and said, I'm going to give you this, it is only by trust and faith and belief in God that everything's going to be okay.
Right.
And for me, as you look at the New Testament, whether it's the Apostle Paul or the writer of the Hebrews, that looks at Abraham and essentially says, he's the father of faith. He's the one that pioneered for us what it means to take a step of trust and faith in God, to move to a place that doesn't in the moment look like it'll ever happen.
Right.
So when Israel is in Egypt and they cry out to God, come and save us, they cry out for hundreds of years before God shows up.
Yep.
It is the same God who is with them in 40 years in the wilderness saying there is a promised land on the other side, even though they walk in circles. It's the same God who comes to them and says, you know, it looks like the story is over now that you're being taken to exile in Babylon.
Yeah.
But surely I have plans for you, plans for a future and for you to prosper, even in the midst that feels like death. Mm-hmm. And it's the same God who comes in Jesus, and as Jesus is going to the cross, there's still this sense of there's a future beyond what's about to happen. And for each of us that follow God in the world, part of our faith is trusting that God has a future for us, even in the midst of whatever it looks like to the contrary.
Yeah.
You know, when we pick up the newspaper, which most of us don't read a newspaper.
Okay, when we go online, let's say that,
when we go online, we watch the nightly news, we look at whatever.
Social media.
We see the images of a world that does not look like it's being saved.
Right.
That it does not look like necessarily God is actively working in the world.
Yeah.
And yet God has promised that there will be a new creation, there will be redemption, there will be justice in the world. Mm-hmm. And we wait and wait and wait, and we have opportunities where we, like Abram, question, God, is this real?
Yeah.
You know, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, they say, how much longer, Lord?
Yeah.
You know, so for us, when we come to this sense of what it means to be people of faith, we often do it through these experiences that God has made promises, and we must trust in those promises, even if reality sometimes seems contrary to that.
Right.
So I want us to think about, in our lives, where do we experience some of those? You know, we look at Abraham's life and we think, you know, if we're old, God's not going to call us to be parents. Mm-hmm. Gosh, I hope not.
I know, right? I'm already tired.
You know, hopefully none of us have to pack up our stuff and move constantly over 40 years.
Yeah. I mean, he spent his whole life moving, really.
Yeah. But not just him, but Israel in general. I hope that, you know, none of us are forced to go into exile.
Yeah.
I hope none of us have to experience the things that God's people in the biblical story has experienced. But each of us goes through what we would call wilderness journeys, dark nights of the soul.
Right, yeah.
So when we think about some of those things, what experiences have you had where you've had to model for yourself and for others what Abram models for all of us as the father of faith?
Yeah, I think that there have been different times in my life where I can remember, in high school when I would go on retreats, or I think maybe just as a high schooler in general, emotions are kind of high and you would just really feel the presence of God. Those mountaintop experiences is what they call them, in youth stuff, that you feel the presence of God and you come back down and the reality looks a little different than what you were living on the mountaintop. And so you don't have that same feeling of God's presence. And I can remember there being a period really late in high school where the youth minister had left. Our youth group was very small. I didn't have almost any friends that were coming to church anymore. And I just felt so alone. And I remember thinking, like, God, where are you? And just feeling like when I prayed, my prayers just hit the ceiling and then smacked me back in the face. And now I look back and I'm like, well, this was kind of this faith moment for me, of like, well, I don't feel you anymore. I don't understand what you're doing. And just kind of being like, okay. And I think I remember asking someone who was leading a small group or something at the time, and saying, because they were talking about how it was faith that saved you. And I remember asking, like, well, what if you just keep doing the actions when the faith isn't there? And I don't know that they understood the question, really. I think it was a hard one. I mean, I think it was harder than I probably even understood it was at the time. And they were like, well, sometimes you just keep going. And I think that was a great answer because, we see one of the beautiful things in this story is that Abraham, he's so far from perfect. He messes up time and time again and loses his faith time and time again, but he keeps going. Yeah. And so I think that is what I see in this, passage is that idea of like, sometimes you don't feel God there. Yeah. And you don't see God working in the world. And you do look out your window and think, is this the world after Jesus came? Mm. Like, I understand why people don't believe, because look around. It doesn't look reconciled to God. This doesn't look like God's kingdom. I hope not anyways. And to have the faith to say, it's not done yet. I always loved that. Like, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Mm. So, what about you?
For me, one of the things I go back to is, Jesus says, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And, growing up hearing that, as I've gotten older, one of the things I've thought about is you can have the faith of a mustard seed, which is a small amount of faith. Mm-hmm. I often tell people faith and doubt work together. They're not necessarily, villains to one another.
Right, yeah, for sure.
And for me, sometimes I may have 60-40 or 40-60. And sometimes my faith might just be that 1% that is the mustard seed. Mm-hmm. But what I try to remind myself is faith isn't so much about just a blind, trust as much as it is loyalty. Yeah. God is loyal to me. I'll be loyal to God, even in moments where I don't know if this is going to work out. Right. There's also a sense when Jesus says this tiny bit of faith can move mountains. I always remind myself, maybe it's not all at once. Maybe it's stone by stone. Yeah. Pebble by pebble. For me, it may be that mountain will get moved in my life, but it may not happen for years and years and years to come. Mm-hmm. It may be erosion that has to move that mountain. Right. For me, in my life, some of the experiences I've had over even the last few years, I know 2 years ago, I think I preached when Dr. Moore was gone, and part of the sermon was talking about faith. And in it, I used kind of an illustration. We were going through some difficult season with Lily's health. And then Amber, we found out that she had breast cancer.
Yeah.
And there was just a moment where this overwhelming sense of no control whatsoever. And not only just no control, just thinking about the fear I had for both of them, but also how much it cost. I mean, there's expenses that come, not just financial, but just mental and emotional. And I just felt so overwhelmed and depleted. And I remember being outside and I prayed and I heard God in the way God speaks is to say, Jeremiah, all you've got to do is love your family. I'll take care of the rest. And for us, sometimes that burden that we feel that we have to carry, part of what righteousness and faith does is God says, I'll take care of the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
All you got to do is just hold my hand.
Right.
And for Abraham, he is made righteous. Paul talks about being saved by faith. And, Abraham is able to do it without circumcision, apart from the law. That's what Paul's talking about when he says those things in Romans. But it also is a sense of God is able to make things whole and right and to heal the things that are broken in our lives if we will just allow God to do it.
Right.
And sometimes faith is just getting out of our own way and saying to ourselves, I can't control this. Let God come in and control it for me. For Paul, he thought that the law, doing everything by the book, living this perfect life, would get him in the right relationship with God. And when he has his Damascus Road experience, he realizes that he missed God when God showed up in Jesus.
Yeah.
For Abraham, if Abraham continues to try to do things on his own, he's just going to get it in his own way. And if you read Genesis 16, you see that he does that.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Even with faith, sometimes we get in our own way. So as we think about, the Lenten journey,
Yeah.
That we are looking at our self-reflection and self-examination of where we resist God's will for our life. How can this Lenten journey be a journey that we can do some assessment of our life and say, where am I getting in the way of God to work in my life? What are some areas, not maybe personal for me and you, but just in general, that we as a church, when we look at, where do we get in our way? Where do we try to maybe put rules and regulations in the way that maybe Paul would say? Where do we become afraid and try to turn back? I love the book of Hebrews. Hebrews uses Abraham and others as kind of models of faith. But the book of Hebrews is written to an audience, a first century Jewish Christian audience, who is tempted to go back.
Right.
And to say, I'm just going to give up because things seem so out of control. So what are some ways that we as a church can look at our faith and say, we've got to put our trust in God and get out of our own way? What are some ways that you see that happening?
I think, one of the ways I see this most in churches, not just our church specifically, but in churches in general, and I think it's just the way humanity is that we love to add things to the gospel. We really like to make extra rules. And I think we see that, when you're talking about Paul, it's always interesting to me when you ask someone, what do you think it takes to be a follower of Jesus? And a lot of people, inevitably, it's that you confess Jesus as your Lord and Savior. But in the messiness of life, a lot of times we add a lot of things to that. And it tends to be that I want whoever it is to look less like Jesus and more like me. And so whatever my rules are, like your clothes, the way you talk, maybe what you believe. Like, do you really believe that to be saved, you just have to confess Christ as your Lord and Savior? And that's a pretty simple line. And that's hard for us to not add on to.
I think, when we think about some of the things that we do to put barriers between God and other people, and I think church historically has done that.
Yeah.
We think about the controversies that have broken up churches, whether it's about how to do the Lord's Supper or baptism or what a specific verse means, or even in our own day, women in ministry, or
right.
All those sorts of things, is that those become obstacles for people that weren't there when they came to Jesus.
Yeah.
They're added to them later. Some of the other ways that I see that we distract ourselves from that pure trust in God's work in our lives is when we start to put our trust in other things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the biblical passages, we've been doing David on Monday Bible study.
Yeah.
And we talk about how that even the good thing that David will become as a good king, God has already warned them that if you do this, you're essentially putting the king and the kingdom separate from God and God's king and kingship. And it will eventually become an idol in of itself. And if you read 1st and 2nd Kings and then into exile, you see that the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings essentially says this is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I think for us, a lot of times we put politics, we put politicians, we put trust in institutions, denominations.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we do that, we've essentially said, God, we have faith in you, but we don't have enough faith for you to fully. So we're going to put it in something else. And eventually those things, if we're not careful, become idols to the point that we can't really know where we've put our trust and faith in.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradual.
Yes.
To the point that people aren't aware sometimes of what they've done until it's too late.
Right. I love the passage in Jeremiah where he talks about, don't build cisterns, which that's a source of water. I mean, that sounds crazy. Like, don't build cisterns because there's going to be drought. We're in the Middle East. Yeah. There's going to be drought. And God is like, don't build cisterns because I will provide water for you. And I think that is like sort of what you're talking about, like don't trust in other things because I'm coming, I'm coming through. I'm faithful. I'm righteous. I am here. But we want to know, the uncertainty of God, what is it? C.S. Lewis says the lion is not tame, Aslan is not a tame beast. Yeah. God does not play by our rules. And so what we want right now may not be what God has for us right now. Mm-hmm. And God, I think, you were talking about politics and leaders and churches and denominations and all these things. But really it's about security. Where do we find our security? Is it, money, right? That's, building the cistern, setting aside, where we want to be able to take care of ourselves. We don't need God. Mm. And I think that's a huge issue for us. I know it. I mean, for me too, personally, to be able to say, okay, God, how do I define what security looks like by you instead of by the world around me? How do I define what strength looks like? I mean, I think about this a lot, having sons, that like strength doesn't look like how strong you are or who can fight the hardest. Strength looks like a man on a cross dying. Those are two different worlds that you have to choose from.
Jesus says that, a real friend is one who's willing to give their life for another. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we view the opposite as valuable, the one that is able to take. As we think about kind of these big issues, for those that are listening, you may be going through something that is more intimate in terms of your relationship with God, but also the circumstances you find yourselves in. So in ministry, we know that there are I always remind myself, if things are going well in my life, enjoy it because something else is coming. And I know that in our lives of faith, there are people that are listening today who are having relationship problems, financial problems, health problems. You may be worried about not just yourself, but maybe a child or a parent. So what I want to remind you is that each of us are like Abraham at points in our lives. In our Lenten devotional, I wrote about a conversation that I've had probably 100 times with Lily as she was smaller. And it was about, when the storm comes up, are we going to be okay?
Yeah.
And in the midst of storms in life, a lot of times we ask ourselves, are we going to be okay? Are we going to be able to get through this?
Yeah.
Is God going to walk with us, or is God abandoning us? And for Abraham, he hears God say, do not be afraid.
That's a hard one.
That's a hard one. Jesus says over and over again, do not be afraid.
Yeah, it's all throughout the Bible.
You know, even at the end of Matthew's gospel, he stands and promises, do not be afraid. I will be with you always, even until the end of the age. And for us, that mustard-sized seed of faith sometimes is to say, God, I know you're with me. I don't know how this is going to end, but I know you're going to walk with me. And for me, in my life, knowing that God has walked with me during those stages of faith and doubt and hardships and seen me through the other side gives me awareness that it will happen again. And it doesn't mean that the other side will be what I want. It may not be what you want. You know, your health may not get better. Your relationship may fall apart.
Right.
Your children may make bad decisions. But it doesn't mean that you've been abandoned. You know, I can't imagine what Abraham feels like to have left everything he knows out in a place that he is by himself and feels like, God, where's this promise you've given me?
Yeah.
You know, so many of us feel that way. And yet God reckons him as righteous, essentially says, it's going to be okay. And you're going to be okay. And for us to hear that voice of God over and over again in our lives, God, I don't know how this is going to work out, but you said it's going to be okay.
And this is not the end.
It is
in
not
this
the
passage that we're reading. It's not
No.
the end where God says, don't worry, it's going to be okay. The sun is shining now.
Yeah.
No, this is like the very middle of the storm.
Yeah.
You know, where he says, even now.
Yeah.
Like, the sun will come.
And the story is still complicated even after he has Isaac.
Yeah.
The awareness we have in our lives is that God doesn't abandon us, that God is always there to walk with us through these difficult seasons, and that God does have a future. The future for us may not be exactly what we want, but it is a future. And it is one that in the end, when it's all said and done, that God will make everything beautiful and new.
And the promise is that we never go alone.
Yeah. So as we move through this season of Lent, I hope that everyone that is listening today, wherever situation you find yourself, is to know, one, that you're not alone because God is with you. But also, we're not alone because we are a part of a larger body. And as a church, we are here for each of you. As ministry staff, if you're going through a situation where you need somebody to just remind you that God's with you, that God loves you, and to show you that love in the way that we love you, reach out to me, to Kelly, to Dr. Moore, to Sarah Hanks, to Sarah Godheim. You don't have to walk through whatever you're going through by yourself. Each of us that get through difficult seasons never do it by ourselves.
No.
So we want to just invite you, if you need one of us, to reach out to us. You can go to ifbc.net and find our contact information. What last thoughts do you have, Kelly, as we think about this trust and this righteousness that Abraham offers us as kind of a model of faith?
I just think it's just a word of hope that, you know, Abraham's not perfect and the journey is long, but he's made righteous really because God is righteous.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of the whole story, right?
It's a gift.
Yeah. And that there's hope for all of us because Abraham's not perfect either, right?
No, he's not. And I hope that you'll have opportunities this week to reflect on this. Join us for worship as we come and worship a God who in Christ Jesus gives us salvation and wholeness and new life, and also a beautiful, beautiful future. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Bye.